So we were founded in 1952, right in the wake of World War II and the Manhattan Project. So the first national laboratory that came out of the Manhattan Project was Los Alamos National Laboratory. Lawrence Livermore was founded really to be the counterculture to Los Alamos. There was a strong desire in the government at that time to have new ideas and significant innovation in national security. And there was concern that if there was only one lab working in this space, you wouldn't have the kind of technical competition and peer review you need to really be excellent. And so in 1952, a site was founded in Livermore, so former Naval Air Station. And our founding fathers are shown here. So Ernest Lawrence, who had really pioneered the idea of team science up at Berkeley and founded the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, where he developed the cyclotron. He had the idea that if you brought together physicists and chemists and engineers and other disciplines, you could really do science at a scale that an individual researcher could not accomplish on their own. Edward Teller, shown in the center there, was one of our he was our second director. And Edward was really marked by big and bold scientific ideas. He was an incredibly smart and forward-looking thinker, and really brought a level of ambition to Livermore that we still feel today in our culture. And Herb York was our first director. Herb was 32 years old when he was made director of this laboratory. And he really laid out our ethos well in this quote that I've shown here. You know, our job is not a traditional government contractor role where folks in the national security community tell us what to do. Our job is to work in partnership with the government to help understand their problems and to help identify science and technology solutions to these vexing problems. So a really unique relationship where we get to be part of informing policymaking, planning in the government, over the horizon thinking about tools and technologies that are really important to the US. And I think this heritage still characterizes our culture today. We're still known as the Big Ideas Lab. So what's our mission? So our core mission is to strengthen national security through world-class science, technology, and engineering. And that really plays out in four major areas. The first is stockpile stewardship. Our most important and central responsibility is to assure the safety, security, and effectiveness of the nation's nuclear deterrent. We do that through an annual assessment process each year, and we use a wide variety of science and engineering and computing tools to understand in great depth the technology so that we can inform the government about the efficacy of today's stockpile and create capabilities for the future. We work across the full space of threats, so chem, bio, nuclear, and emerging threat areas like cyber or space, and really use that knowledge we have in understanding defense technologies to understanding what our adversaries might be doing and identifying ways to mitigate or counter their activities. We have an emerging significant focus on multi-domain deterrence. The world's gotten very complicated in the last several decades, and emerging domains like space and cyber are really important in the national security realm. And so we're working to think through how activities in those domains might interact with each other and perhaps allow us to achieve advantage by bringing capabilities together across domains. And then we have a very significant footprint in energy security and climate resilience. And this is a very long-standing mission for us. So the first global circulation models that were created here at Lawrence Livermore, and they grew directly out of the modeling and simulation capabilities that we had built for our core nuclear weapons mission activities. The way we do all this work is on a foundation of disciplinary excellence across many fields of science. Engineering, we have 2,500 engineers on the staff here, and we're particularly good at engineering things that are first of a kind, one of a kind, or at a significant scale. So shown in the center there is something I'll talk about later, the National Ignition Facility, the world's largest, most energetic laser that exists here at Livermore. And then computing. And Livermore has long been on the forefront of computing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So as I said, stockpile stewardship is the core mission of the laboratory, and it really shapes the things that we're good at. So the basic idea is we use experimental data, modeling and simulation, and expert judgment to make informed decisions about the stockpile. In the development era, we did that with the addition of nuclear testing. And since 1992, the US has not conducted any nuclear tests. So today we've built an incredible array of scientific tools that give us a much deeper and higher fidelity understanding of the underlying physics, chemistry, material science, and engineering. And we use that legacy data along with these new tools to inform that mission. But people are really at the heart of it. And so a big part of what we do is try to cultivate a workforce that's operating at the very frontiers of science and technology, engaging in the international community, really testing their mettle on the toughest scientific problems that they can find. The core competencies that the laboratory stewards are shown here. I'll talk about a few of these, but these really define the set of capabilities and the kinds of people that we have in our workforce. High energy density science is a central focus for us. That's the study of matter at the most extreme conditions in the universe. Advanced materials and manufacturing. That's everything from understanding the fundamental properties of materials through to developing new tools and technologies for making exotic materials and manufactured objects. Significant capabilities in bioscience and bioengineering, and that has a significant center point around the application of high performance computing to bioscience problems. I already mentioned earth and atmospheric science. We have tremendous capabilities for climate modeling. For example, we host the program for climate model diagnosis and intercomparison, which is the program that generates the comparisons across all the international climate models and form the basis of the information that go into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, for example. As home to the world's largest, most energetic laser, you might imagine we have significant expertise in lasers and optical science and technology. And it's actually that connection that brought me here to Livermore. Dr. Rhodes' lab, when I was working there, was an international leader in both high energy lasers, but also strong field laser matter interactions. And so a natural companion in that work were teams at Lawrence Livermore. And we had researchers from Livermore who actually spent summers working with us. And so through those connections, I was able to find a place in the laser program here at Lawrence Livermore. That nuclear, chemical, and isotopic S&T is really a big area for us, not just traditional nuclear physics, which we're exceptionally good at, but nuclear chemistry and radiochemistry as well. Understanding isotopic debris was a core competency that grew out of nuclear weapons testing, but today plays a key role in nuclear forensics and in astrochemistry, where you can use those tools and techniques to study samples that come back from space missions, for example. And then high performance computing, simulation, and data science. And we have an emerging focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence, which is really very exciting. Also advanced architectures and next generation computing technologies, things like quantum computing or neuromorphic computing. So how does that play out? What do we do with all this capability and all this fundamental science? So at heart, we have sort of two pillars in how we work. We use very sophisticated experimental science to both advance our knowledge and to challenge our current understanding. And we compare that and use that in concert with our high performance computing assets. So we build very sophisticated modeling and simulation tools, multi-physics simulation tools that can allow us to do things like model complex systems like the climate, and very specialized tools that allow us to do things like understand the fundamental properties of materials, so things like molecular dynamics. We're home to many of the biggest computers in the world. The one shown here is our current biggest computer, the Sierra machine, and we routinely trade the top spot with a couple of the other DOE labs and researchers in China. So this interplay between experimental science and computing is really a core feature of our lab. I have to say, I'm an experimentalist by training and by temperament. And so I have, a certain bias toward Mother Nature. Mother Nature can be a cruel mistress and has shown us often the limits of our knowledge. So having that ground truth understanding to really challenge our simulation capabilities is important. The codes are amazing. What we can do with modeling and simulation today is quite extraordinary. But to first order, the codes and the computers know what we know. So where there are limits to our knowledge or gaps in our knowledge, experimental science will always play a role. So that's my ad for experimental science. As I said, we've played a role in computing since our founding. The very first major procurement this lab made in 1952 was a supercomputer of the day, the UNIVAC 1. And we were on a slow, steady trajectory of increasing capability through the 1980s, when at the point where the US stopped nuclear testing, a new program was created to replace that component of the Stockpile program with modeling and simulation. So we would make a tremendous advance in modeling and simulation and computational capacity so that we could do full system models of nuclear weapons performance and use that to underwrite our confidence in the stockpile. So over the next 2 decades, leading up to today, the pace has been quite extraordinary in advance. And a lot of this has been driven by researchers at Lawrence Livermore. We created a really unique set of partnerships with industrial vendors that build high performance computing machines, with academic partners, where we co-designed and developed the machines and the scientific modeling and simulation tools so that we could get best use from the computers. So today I mentioned we're at 125 petaflops with Sierra. In another year or so, we'll start taking delivery of El Capitan, which will be the first exascale computer dedicated to national security. So we're really excited about what that will offer. We're investigating new technologies and new approaches. I mentioned neuromorphic and quantum computing. It's early days in some of these fields, but the opportunity is very significant to do new types of computing, be able to tackle problems at a level of complexity well beyond what we can do today. The chart at the left shows the current data on what I mentioned in terms of leadership and high performance computing. Livermore today is home to, I think, 8 of the top 100 computers in the world. And because of our long legacy in this area, we've long dominated the field across the DOE labs. You'll note that the international scene has been changing dramatically in the last 2 decades. And the most capable computers that are being built in China today are being completely built with indigenous components. And so this is a really internationally competitive and rich field where there's lots of work, lots of exciting work to be done. We do fundamental science, and I think this is a really important component of what we do. It's where we give our people the opportunity to hone their skills and advance our capabilities in really new and unique ways. The group that does our radiochemistry for the stockpile has had a long collaboration with a group in Russia discovering heavy elements. So there's been long been a prediction that as you move up in atomic weight, there'll come a point where you move beyond the unstable elements that reside at the top end of the periodic table and reach what's called the island of stability. So researchers have been creating increasingly heavy, super heavy elements, looking for this island of stability. And Livermore has helped put 6 elements on the periodic table as part of that process. One of the recent ones, because of this long legacy, was named after Livermore, Livermorium, element 116, which is kind of cool. I mentioned our work in biosciences. So we got into the biosciences very early in our history, studying the health effects of radiation on humans. In recent years, we have really turned our attention to understanding how to use high performance computing to understand biological systems. And this has been a long sought goal, but it's a really hard problem. Biological systems are extraordinarily complex relative to the kinds of physical systems we typically model with computing. So it's taken many decades to build the capabilities and build models that have sufficient physics and chemistry in them to make accurate predictions of how biological systems will operate. About 10 years ago, we started a program looking at how you could use computing to really accelerate the process of drug development. So the process of drug development typically takes about 10 years from the identification of a new therapeutic until it's available. And a lot of that timeline is driven by testing, and in particular, human testing. So we had the idea that you could do a lot of the screening of candidate molecules in the computer, and you could also screen for things like potential toxic effects in humans, like cardiotoxicity, which is one of the key reasons drugs fail. Turns out this was a great idea 10 years ago, although it was very hard to get a coherent effort in the government to support it. We did start creating some very interesting partnerships, though, to move this work along. And we created the partnership I've shown here on the left, the ATOM collaboration, where the Department of Energy, the National Cancer Institute got together and decided to see what we could do with this modeling and simulation approach. And so Lawrence Livermore, University of California, San Francisco, which has one of the leading clinical research programs in the world, and GlaxoSmithKline, one of the big pharma companies, got together to create a collaboration that would develop tools to do this optimized design process for new drug therapeutics. And so that's been operating for some time now. We've added a whole host of new partners to that collaboration. And they're really showing that you can take this long development process and this very difficult process of screening candidates from many years down to very short timescales. Now that we have spent a year and a half living through the COVID-19 pandemic, I think people are very clear that this idea of speeding the drug development timeline is incredibly important. And during the pandemic, we were able to use these tools to look at ways, again, to identify promising therapeutics, to screen potential molecules for vaccines and therapeutics, and in one project to look at redesigning antibodies to be used against SARS-CoV-2. We've also developed novel experimental platforms that will allow us to do some of the testing on engineered organs as opposed to in humans. So again, trying to get the human testing component to be as short and as low impact as possible in this process. So really, really very exciting and very impactful. And this SARS-CoV-2 response work involved laboratories across the DOE system. We created something called the National Virtual Bio Laboratory to step up and really aid the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. With our engineering capabilities, we've also done some really interesting things in the biosciences. This is one example that's quite remarkable. The picture at the left is an artist's representation of a biocompatible neural probe. Some researchers at UCSF worked with us to implant this in the hippocampus of a person's brain and actually demonstrated that they can read their thoughts in situ using this probe by measuring the signals going across that structure in the brain while the person is thinking. So developing techniques to help understand how memories are formed and how the human brain really operates at very fundamental levels. Quite amazing. We're in California. California is perhaps the biggest living laboratory for climate change in the country. We have everything: wildfires, droughts, rising seas, significant agricultural impacts. So this has been a huge focus for the state of California. We were able to work with our researchers in the state to assess California's plan to be carbon neutral by 2045. And so the Getting to Neutral report assessed things like technologies for decarbonizing the environment, which could include enhancing the soil's ability to hold carbon or other mechanical carbon capture and sequestration techniques, and demonstrated that many of the tools and technologies are in hand today. And we're now working to build partnerships across the state to take some of those technologies out in the field and see what we can do. We're also a leader in climate modeling. As I mentioned today, we can now resolve simulations, moving down toward the kilometer scale. That's the scale at which you need to model things to really understand climate impacts. And that can help with planning and development of strategies for mitigations for communities. So it's becoming a bigger and bigger focus for us. We're big innovators in the area of materials and advanced manufacturing. We have developed a very significant effort in additive manufacturing in particular, working across the full range of materials from polymers, where we've developed a number of really novel techniques and tools, all the way through to metals and large engineered objects. We're also applying modeling and simulation tools to do design optimization and error correction in situ with these processes to really advance the state of the art in manufacturing. I'm going to show you one example that's kind of cool. This is something we worked on with UC Berkeley to develop a scheme to monolithically print objects. So this is a 3D object where we take tomographic images of it. So we take a number of slices, we load those up, and then we project those images into a special resin, which allows that object any second now to form monolithically in the resin and cure. So pretty cool. Pour off the uncured resin and your very own personal thinker emerges. So really novel stuff, and it's bringing a lot of new people and new ideas to the laboratory. So, and as Russ mentioned, when I first met him, I was managing a material science portfolio, working with a leadership at DOE to manage material science portfolio. My core expertise is actually in what today would be called high energy density science. And so one of the things that Livermore is an international leader in is the study of matter at the most extreme conditions in the universe, building off our core mission. So I'm going to talk to you now in great depth on some of the work that we're doing in high energy density science, because this is such an extraordinary pillar for the lab. So if you think about matter in the universe, you can think about the things we're familiar with, ordinary matter, although looking at that picture, that doesn't look like my family room. Seems like somewhat extraordinary matter. If you start going up in pressure and temperature, you start accessing megabar conditions, and you start finding things like the conditions at the center of giant planets. And as you move all the way up into the plasma regime and the highest pressures and temperatures, you start probing the conditions that are resident in the center of stars, like our sun. Our interest in this, of course, grows out of our desire to understand the physics that underwrites the operation of thermonuclear weapons. But there's never been a laboratory-based platform to really study these extreme conditions in detail. So there's been an extraordinary effort here over decades to build the tools that will allow us to really probe these much more extreme states of matter and tease out their secrets. So our lab is run by a part of the Department of Energy called the National Nuclear Security Administration, and across the NNSA labs, our lab, Los Alamos and Sandia National Laboratory, this field of study is particularly important. So the NNSA has created a unique set of facilities to study these conditions. Here at Livermore, we have the National Ignition Facility. It's the world's largest, most energetic laser. It allows us to very precisely probe these conditions in a very flexible and highly reconfigurable environment by shining all of that laser light down into very small targets. We can access very short time scales, but very, very, very high pressures. So we've demonstrated up to gigabar pressures, but for less than a billionth of a second. The Z machine at Sandia is a magnetically driven pulse power machine. That really is a complementary capability. It can get to pretty high pressures, 10 megabars or so, but it can hold those pressures for longer timescales. So if you're thinking about material processes, which can be slower, nanosecond to microsecond timescales can be really important. And then we have a university partner in Rochester, New York, where the Omega laser resides, where they can do rapid diagnostic and platform development to support the bigger facilities, where shots are more scarce and more expensive because of the scale and complexity. So this is a picture looking into the target chamber of the laser. It's a 3-meter diameter target chamber, 3-meter radius. 3-meter radius, yeah. Diameter target chamber, you can see this big boom that's shown here. That's the target inserter. So way at the end of that boom is the tiny target. So the NIF laser has 192 beams. The energy from those 192 beams are all focused into this tiny target at the center here, and that's what allows us to generate those incredibly extreme conditions for very short periods of time. So really very sophisticated. For the record, these people are doing maintenance inside the chamber. There are no people inside the chamber when we're doing experiments. So a picture of the exterior of the facility for the NIF. The building, the roof of the building is the size of 3 football fields, and it's 7 stories tall. So quite enormous in scale. This is a shot into the laser bay. So this is looking down on the amplifiers for the laser. So this is the length of this room is that 3 football fields long. Each of these little tubes here is 1 laser beam that will go ultimately to the target chamber. The total energy this laser can put out is about 2 megajoules. So our previous laser, which was the largest laser in the world of the time, and the one on which I did my postdoc research and early career research, the NOVA laser, was about a 40 kilojoule laser. So enormous step up in energy and power. The laser operates in the infrared. It puts out about 4 megajoules of infrared light. For our experimental work, we convert that to blue light, ultraviolet light, and that's where we get down to the 2 megajoule regime. I'm showing you for scale this second view of the target bay. All of these laser amplifiers are up in the air so that they can be accessed from below for maintenance. There's a canonical person standing in the hallway, so you can get a sense of how extraordinarily large and complex the facility is. So the scheme for the laser is quite simple. We generate a small pulse of light. We split that pulse many ways and begin to amplify it. At some point, we inject it into these large-scale amplifiers, 192 of them, and amplify it all the way up to that 2 megajoule level, and then convert the light to the blue and deliver it to the target bay. This is a picture of where the target bay, this is actually from yesterday. We had this gentleman in the center is David Turk. He's the Deputy Secretary of Energy. So here he is visiting our lab. You can see these boxes that surround the target chamber. You can't see much of the target chamber. It's the blue ball in the center there. These are the optics assemblies where the frequency conversion is done, sending the light into the chamber, and the focusing lenses reside. There are many other things bolted onto the chamber. Those are diagnostic capabilities that allow us to access the, understand what's happening in the experiments. Those 192 beams are split into 2 sets. 96 come into the top of the chamber, 96 come into the bottom. So we have not a spherical distribution of beams, but sort of a polar oriented distribution of beams. And that's me right there, my hard hat. This picture here is, again, to give you the sense of scale. This is Jill Ruby. She's the administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, but that stalk there, at the end of it, has the target. So this enormous laser, all this energy, all these giant beams will be focused into that tiny target. If you go to the movies and you've seen the 2010 movie Star Trek Into Darkness, you'll recognize our laser because it was featured as the warp core of the Starship Enterprise. So this stuff in the background here is actually the NIF target chamber. They filmed scenes for the movie here at Livermore. Of all the top secret things we've ever done at the lab, this was the most top secret. Nobody knew this was happening when it was going on. So what do we do with these HED facilities? Well, as I said, we're looking to study the most extreme conditions in the universe. So we can do things like planetary science, look at materials like iron or nickel under very high pressures, so we can understand how giant planets form and what their constituent properties are. We can study new materials. So under these extreme conditions, we can create conditions that wouldn't otherwise exist and force new structures to be stable. We do a great deal of work on plasma astrophysics. We can create very unique plasma hot matter conditions. And we can do many types of high intensity laser matter interactions. So you don't have to use all 192 beams at the same time. We can use the beams at different timings so that we can do pump probe type experiments. We can generate different geometries so that we can probe all sorts of different kinds of physics. And one of the important kinds of physics for us is fusion, DT fusion, much like the process that happens in the core of the sun. But the goal for us is to use this gold can that's shown in the center to turn the laser energy into an X-ray bath. That X-ray bath heats up the capsule, little tiny capsule in the center there. And as the outer surface blows off, the inner surface blows in, and we're able to squeeze up a small amount of deuterium and tritium and create fusion reactions in the laboratory. If we can really make this work successfully, then we have the core component of what could be an inertial fusion energy-based reactor for the future. So this is just to give you a sense of the scale. So those little capsules I showed you schematically are about 2 millimeters in diameter. So this is a picture, an actual picture of one. When we compress them up, these smaller X-ray images show you how small the core gets under compression. The center picture is the entire target assembly. So that's the gold can that I showed you. There's some diagnostic ports there. A lot of this other metal around the outsides is either shielding to keep laser light that doesn't convert to the blue away from the target, or to deliver cryogenic temperatures to the target so we can cool them down. Just going to show a couple of results from our scientific program at the NIF. One of the most interesting things that we've been able to do in recent years is push our experiments to extraordinarily high pressures. So we can put very small samples of material into these laser targets and compress them up to extraordinary pressures, and then test models of the physics in those regimes against the data that we're taking on the laser. So this is really giving the astrophysical community access to really high quality data to drive their understanding of astrophysical systems. So this data took, this work took these shock Hugonio measurements all the way up into the radiative regime, up here into the near gigabar pressure regimes. The kind of work that I did on the laser was a lot of it was studying hydrodynamic instabilities. So here we take a rippled interface and we run a shock wave across it and then watch those ripples grow. And from the way they grow, we can say something about the properties of the material and the types of instabilities that develop. So these are extraordinary pictures of targets. Again, this whole target is about 1 centimeter in diameter. And these are, 100 micron scale features that we're able to resolve. But the centerpiece that we've been seeking for 6 decades is creating fusion ignition in the laboratory. So shortly after the laser was invented, one of our scientists, John Knuckles, had the idea that unlike what we had been doing to that point, which is creating thermonuclear fusion in nuclear weapons, you could create a laboratory-based system using lasers that would compress DT fuel to achieve ignition in the laboratory. He published a seminal paper in 1972 laying this idea out. And since then, we've been on this march, building bigger and bigger laser facilities, trying to get to the energy that would be required to make that fusion ignition process go. The initial projection that John made was that 1 kilojoule, 1,000 joules of laser energy would be enough. Of course, that only works in 1D. Today, we're at 2 megajoules and counting, and I'll show you in a minute, we're very, very close. So we put that little target in the center of our giant target chamber, and then we put a huge array of diagnostics around it to really understand how the process is proceeding. That includes things like looking at neutrons that come out of the fusion process and where they go. That helps us understand how symmetric the implosion is and how stationary the fuel is in the capsule. We can take pictures of that hot dense core and really understand how well the implosion is proceeding. And we can do things like gamma spectroscopy to understand how long it burns and what the peak emission looks like and what the timing was of that peak ignition yield. So really extraordinary array of diagnostics developed over several decades. We've been working hard to lower the barriers to ignition. Turns out it's really hard. Plasmas are really hard to confine and they're very difficult to control. And so we've used modeling and simulation, extraordinary advances in diagnostics across a huge array of types, and really improved targets. The targets have to be incredibly precise so that they stay together as that implosion proceeds. And we're looking at advanced concepts like adding magnetic fields. Magnetic fields can help hold that fuel together a little bit longer so the fusion can proceed. So where are we at? So in 2010, we started operating the NIF laser and started what we call the National Ignition Campaign. That was our first attempt at this 2 megajoule energy threshold to look at the prospects for fusion ignition in the lab. We were able to generate on about 2.5 kilojoules of fusion yield. So remember, 2 megajoules in, 2.5 kilojoules out. So we're still at about a factor of 100,000 loss in that calculus. We changed our target design a little bit and we boosted that up to 25 kilojoules. So now we're doing a little better. We're getting sort of in the 100 regime. We made some more changes and pushed that up to 55 kilojoules. This is about 2017, 2018. And then last year, we were able to push up to about 170 kilojoules, which was really exciting. The team had a new experimental design that really allowed that fusion fuel to hold together just long enough to start allowing the fusion process to deposit its energy back in the fuel and generate new fusions. So that process, alpha heating process, is really important to making this go. And then just this last August, we had a shot that produced 1.35 megajoules of yield. So not quite break even, which would be target gain of 1, but target gain of 0.7. So after 6 decades of work, we finally arrived directly on the threshold of ignition. So we're really excited. This experiment demonstrates proof positive that we can get to the ignition threshold at the National Ignition Facility, and we are starting to plan for what comes next. I think I'll just skip this. This program is a huge community effort. Many institutions, academic, national laboratory, international work in this area. As we have a huge user community that does all kinds of really exciting and interesting physics on the facility. We publish a lot. This is one of the biggest generators of publications at our laboratory. And our folks are really well respected in the international scientific community. So we have lots of APS fellows, award winners, and very well-regarded scientists in this realm. And this is one of the key areas where we engage with the academic world. We have a high energy density science center that acts as our bridge to the outside community, runs student programs. We have many, many student interns. During the pandemic, we've had about 600 or so student interns each summer, mostly virtual. In a normal year, we'll usually have about 1,200 student interns, most of them working on site. So really exciting opportunities to be a part of these big programs and learn about science at a very different scale. So I encourage you to look at our website and other lab websites to check those programs out. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to take a whack at any questions you might have.
Thank you, Kim, for that wonderful overview. And great to hear about the breadth of programs as well as the discussion of the famous August 8th shot at NIF, which was described in one of your press releases yesterday as a Wright brothers moment. So maybe you can comment on the reproducing of that shot. But before that, I want to open this up to students, and in particular, and if you have time, yes, to take some questions.
Yeah.
Anybody just unmute yourself, use the chat, or raise your hand.
I had a question about the target gain function of 0.07, the famous one. So when do you expect the target gain function to be of 1, and what are the future plans after that? Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So that was, as Russ said, this was a really exciting moment. We had predicted that the gain on that shot, that the yield on that shot would be about 450 kilojoules. So it was a good surprise, went in the correct direction. And we just did a repeat, and as close as possible to an exact copy of the experiment we did in August. And we achieved about 450 kilojoules, so right where we predicted, which was still a factor of 3 higher than we'd been before. So there's sort of 3 things you have to get right in these targets. You have to push the capsule very hard and very fast. You have to make it stay very symmetric. So the fuel needs to be basically stationary when it's burning, and the capsule needs to stay together. So those instabilities I showed are caused when you have different density fluids pushing against each other. And so the surface of the capsule is unstable, and those perturbations can lead to holes in the capsule. So any of those things can make the fuel, cool the fuel and make it stop burning. So we've done a great job of making the capsules really very smooth and perfect, so they implode nicely and they're pretty stable. We've worked on how you shape the laser pulse going in to improve that process. The one thing that we can't perfectly control is exactly how all 192 beams deliver their energy. So it turns out if the energy is a little bit asymmetric, and it can be a very little bit, you get a little bit of velocity in the fusion fuel, it starts moving, and we can see that in the data, and that takes the yield down. So in the big shot, it turns out everything lined up just right, and the fuel was very stationary, very symmetric. The target was really stable, 1.35 megajoules. This time there's a little bit of velocity in the fuel, and so a little bit lower yield. The feature of the gain curve there is that it's exponential. And so very, very small changes could lead to very, very high variability in the outcome. So my personal hope is the next one does the opposite. So it aligns just a little more perfectly. And then we'll be over 2 megajoules, and I'll be allowed to say ignition with a clean conscience, because we really are very, very close. Very, very close. So I'm hoping in the next, we have 2 more repeats planned, one this coming Sunday and then another one coming up. And hopefully one of those 2 will yield another press release from us.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Very exciting, and all the best.
Thank you. We need everyone, fingers crossed.
Okay. Thank you. More questions?
I have a question for Kim. Do you have any plans of changing all-around size for upcoming shots?
So for this series of 4 shots, we're trying to keep things exactly the same. So on that big shot, we had changed, I think, 5 things. 3 of them are things we know make everything better. One was a very symmetric arrangement of the diagnostic holes. One was making the fill tube that sends the DT into the target 2 microns, which is quite extraordinary. And the other were these, selecting very high quality diamond capsules. The other variables, though, I think we're going to continue to explore. So the size of the hole room and the size of the hole room relative to the size of the capsule, or what they call the case to capsule ratio. which changes how the laser energy, the X-rays that are produced couple to the capsule. We change the size of the laser entrance holes and the shape of the laser pulse, and that determines how hot the whole room gets. And so we'll play around with that to see if we can optimize it more from where we're at. And then the third thing we'll look at for sure is capsule material, because we're using diamond capsules currently. It turns out diamond has a lot of good properties and allows us to use a very favorable laser pulse shape. But we've looked at other materials in the past, and I think we'll explore that space as well. It's hard to make this quality of diamond capsules.
Thank you.
And we'll hope maybe we'll eke a little more energy out of the laser. I'm hopeful that we'll get an opportunity to refurbish the laser, and you know, a 10-year-old high-tech facility is pretty old, and it's been operating full tilt that whole time. So we really do need to do some sprucing up of some of its systems.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions?
Kim, I'll ask a question. So Livermore is always at the cutting edge of building new lasers. What's next for lasers at Livermore?
Funny you should ask, Roger. I didn't realize there were ringers in the audience. Sorry. So we have been building lasers of other types, including very high repetition rate petawatt lasers, so high energy, short pulse lasers. We built a laser called the high intensity, it's called HAPLS. I'm not going to get the acronym right, for the Eli Beamlines project in the Czech Republic. So a very high intensity, high rep rate laser for doing science. We're also working to develop diode technology. So one of the limitations for lasers like the NIF is that the way we deliver the energy to the laser glass is with flash lamps, not a very efficient process. And diode technology has been advancing very dramatically. And so we're hoping we can use laser diodes to drive our next generation of lasers, potentially for a next generation facility. You can more efficiently pump the energy into the gain medium with diodes as opposed to flash lamps. You could probably say more about it than I can, Roger.
Great answer.
Thanks, Roger. I was impressed, Kim, that you highlighted the number of publications that are coming out and the balance you have now in supporting discovery science, academic use, as opposed to, say, 10 years ago when there was this big focus on ignition, and that was the academic work, or the discovery science work was sort of slowed down a bit. And so do you see any change in the balance going forward, and having academic researchers there doing various kinds of experiments now that you are on this new path, presumably, or all these new results that are coming in with regard to ignition?
Yeah, well, I'm hoping, and we've always had a very modest fraction of the laser time dedicated to discovery science. So 10 to 15% of the laser time is dedicated to those pursuits. They're incredibly important to the intellectual life of the facility. And a lot of the techniques that we've used in our core ignition work and other programmatic work have been developed in those academic partnerships. So I personally would like to see a larger fraction of the facility time dedicated to those kinds of activities. They're great for new ideas and new people, but they're also great for our researchers to stretch their skills and to think more broadly, which is one of the key things that the facility does for us. We are going to start thinking about what the next facility is, because people who build big lasers are always thinking about what the next one is. Now that we've gotten to this threshold, we expect we'll be able to push this, we will eventually get past 2 megajoules and we'll get to, say, 10 megajoules. But there are limits to what this laser could do. And so for us, the ultimate goal is to have a very high yield facility. And so we'll also start thinking about how to begin planning for developing, designing, and then ultimately building a next big facility as well. So I'm hopeful we'll at least hold our line on fundamental science where it's at, and with time grow it.
Good to hear. Thank you. More questions?
Can I ask a quick question?
Go ahead.
This is Mukhtar Ahmad from UIC. It's not scientific, rather I would like to know how many people involved in any experiment, from maybe people were varied from shock to fusion experiment. In general, how many, including supporting people?
Yeah, so there's, at the facility, there's 700 people who work to operate the facility. So we'll set that group of people aside for the moment. For an experimental team, there's usually several dozen people involved because you have target fab, diagnostics, design, modeling and simulation, and then the core experimental team that's bringing that all together. And so the collaborations can be quite large and have a number of people involved. Once we have a mature platform, and for us, a platform is really an experimental configuration. So that's, a target type that generates a certain set of conditions. Once you have one of those platforms, then it's easier for small teams to take them and do different types of experiments with them. But a lot of what we do is new or first of a kind platforms, and that really does require a really big team of physicists, chemists, engineers, and material scientists to make it go.
Thank you.
Not quite high energy physics, but big teams.
Okay, maybe one more question.
May
Okay.
I ask another question, Russ?
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. So, Kim, another laser that is producing good result is arc laser, and proton and electron energies are higher than what is predicted by quantum scaling, for example. So, are there any plans to increase the energy of arc laser further from 4 or 5 kilojoule?
No, so for the group, the arc laser is the advanced radiographic capability. So those are short pulse beam lines that use the NIF and then compress the pulses to make very high energy short pulses to do things like generate X-ray backlighters or to do very strong, high intensity physics experiments. So no intent there. There are some discussions underway at other facilities about increasing the number of short pulse beam lines that are available, or thinking about potential fast ignition type facilities in the future. So in fast ignition, you compress the capsule, the fusion capsule partway, and then you light it with a short pulse, as opposed to having to compress it to a very small size and have it self-ignite. So not here, but maybe somewhere else.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Kim, thank you for this terrific talk and for spending so much time with us. You're a very busy person, especially given all that's happening at Livermore right now. So we're all so grateful. So on behalf of all of us here in the audience, thanks.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. It was fun. It was nice to think about science for an hour.
Okay, great.
Take care.
Bye-bye.